The pod sold at auction for 1 credit. Kale Morrow paid it without blinking, which told the auctioneer everything she needed to know about him. Nobody paid 1 credit for a dead pod unless they had no credits left, or unless they knew something nobody else did. The auctioneer, a 4-armed Teshari with reading lenses over 2 of her 6 eyes, watched the human sign the transfer slip with a scratched stylus and drag the pod toward the maintenance bay on a float dolly that squealed every 3rd rotation. She watched him go. Then she went back to her screen and forgot about him. That was her first mistake. It would not be the last one made that day on Salvage Station, Uran 9. The station floated in the gravity shadow of a dead world called Osk, a cinder planet, stripped bare 100 years ago by the Teshari mining conglomerate, and then abandoned when the cores ran dry. Uran 9 had grown up around the carcass of an old extractor platform, one ring of habitation bolted to another over the decades, until the thing was a crooked spiral of pressurized corridors, black market stalls, and recycled air that smelled permanently of machine oil and something sweet and rotten that nobody had ever successfully identified. The conglomerate didn't officially acknowledge the station's existence. That was fine. The station preferred it that way. Kale Morrow had been living on Uran 9 for 8 months. He'd come in on a salvage contract that dried up 2 months after arrival, when the company that hired him went into receivership and stopped answering messages. He was left with his tools, his suit, a berth in the lower residential ring that cost him 11 credits a week, and a reputation for being the only being on the station who could strip a Class IV extractor coupling bare-handed in the dark. He was 34 years old. He had a scar that started below his left ear and ended somewhere under his collar, and he never explained it. He had dark circles under his eyes that he'd stopped trying to sleep away. He had a habit of tapping the knuckle of his right index finger against any surface. He was leaning on walls, tables, the edge of an airlock door, in a rhythm that wasn't quite random and wasn't quite music. 3 Teshari soldiers saw him that day. Each one told a different story. The first was a conscript named Drevash 4, young enough that his carapace hadn't fully hardened yet, still showing the pale amber of newly formed chitin at the joints of his upper arms. He'd been posted to the maintenance level on what his sergeant called a discipline assignment, which meant he'd failed an inspection, and was being punished with 8 hours of watching empty corridors. He had a reader tucked inside his helmet to pass the time. He was reading about water sports on Teshari Prime when the lights went out. Not all the lights, just the ones in his section, corridor J9 through J14, a stretch of maintenance tunnel that connected the station's lower processing bay to the ventilation exchange. It lasted 4 seconds. Then the emergency strips flickered on, bathing everything in cold amber, and Drevash 4 looked up from his reader and saw a shape at the far end of the corridor that had not been there before. It was tall, or it seemed tall. The shadows did something strange with its proportions, stretching it against the wall so that it looked like it occupied more space than was physically possible. It was not moving. It was simply present, the way a threat is present before it announces itself, the way pressure builds before a seal gives out. Drevash 4's training told him to challenge. His instincts told him to run. He compromised by doing neither, pressing himself against the wall and holding very still while the shape at the end of the corridor seemed to breathe, not visibly, not audibly, but in some way he felt in his chest, a rhythm that was wrong, that belonged to something other than the recycled air of the station. Then it was gone. He looked left. He looked right. He checked the maintenance panel beside him, the one that controlled the lighting grid for this section of the station. It had been accessed. The panel cover was ajar, swinging slightly, though there was no draft in the corridor. The housing was unlatched but not damaged. Whatever had opened it correctly, with knowledge of the mechanism. Drevash 4 filed his report when his shift ended. He described the shape as something between 8 and 12 feet tall, possibly taller. He described it as dark, but not the dark of a suit, the dark of something that was made of shadow, that wore it like skin. He described the way it had simply ceased to exist when he looked away, the way it had not moved so much as relocated. He described it, in the careful language of an official military report, as a being of shadow that moved through walls. His sergeant read the report. His sergeant, who had been stationed on Uran 9 for 3 years, and had seen enough of the station's strange physics to not immediately dismiss anything, forwarded it up the chain. What Drevash 4 had actually seen was Kale Morrow, crouched inside a maintenance crawlway that ran between the ceiling and the lighting grid, moving hand over hand through a passage that was 56 centimeters wide and smelled strongly of coolant. Kale knew about the crawlways because he'd spent 6 weeks mapping them in his first month on the station, back when he was still trying to find contract work and had needed routes that bypassed the toll corridors. He'd cataloged 42 separate crawlway junctions. He could move through most of them in the dark, by touch, by the particular quality of the air near a junction, by the sound of the recycling fans that marked each ventilation node. He'd accessed the J-section lighting panel because he needed to kill the lights while he crossed between 2 crawlway entry points. It took him 4 seconds. The shadow Drevash 4 had seen was the entry panel door swinging open, catching the emergency strips at an angle, casting Kale's silhouette long and strange across the corridor floor. Kale hadn't even seen the soldier. He'd been looking at the panel. He'd opened it, killed the section, crossed the corridor in 3 steps, and been inside the opposite crawlway entry before the emergency strips came on. He hadn't been 8 feet tall. He was 5'11" in his work boots. He was looking for the woman. Her name, as far as the manifest on the dead pod had indicated, was Specialist Mara Coles, Interstellar Survey Corps, assigned to a mapping mission in the OSC system 6 years ago. The pod was listed as an emergency evac unit from the survey ship ISV Perseverance, which had been posted as lost with all hands 5 years, 9 months, and 14 days ago. The pod had a dead power cell, a cracked inner seal, and the kind of long-term preservation status on the life support capsule that you only triggered if you were either very desperate or following a very specific protocol. Kale had checked the pod's preservation status the moment he got it to the maintenance bay. The reading was active, marginal, barely. But active. He'd cracked the outer housing and found her on the second day. She was inside the life support capsule, a woman, human, mid-30s probably, in an orange survey suit that had gone pale with age. She was alive in the technical sense that her autonomic systems were running, and her brain was showing slow wave activity, and her heart was doing something every 90 seconds that qualified as a beat. She was not alive in any sense that you could have a conversation with or make eye contact at. Her skin was the color of old paper. The capsule's nutrient feed had kept her body functional barely, on minimum resource consumption. She was the last survivor of the Perseverance. She'd been adrift in a dead pod in the gravity shadow of OSC for nearly 6 years. She'd survived by triggering a deep preservation protocol that the Survey Corps called Minimum Function Status, MFS, which the crews called Minimum, which the crews also called the Long Sleep, and the Real Dark, and what you do when dying slowly is your best option. Kale needed 3 things to bring her out of it. He needed a working power cell to restore the capsule's primary systems. He needed a sealed medical suite with a functional atmosphere scrubber. He needed a thermal regulation unit capable of bringing her core temperature up at the correct rate. Too fast and the cellular damage was catastrophic. Too slow, and she simply didn't come back. He had none of these things. He had a plan to get all 3. The second soldier was named Vres, a combat veteran of 6 campaigns who had transferred to Uran 9 2 years ago after taking a wound to 3 of her primary limbs that had ended her field service. She ran security for a Teshari freight operation that used the station as a waypoint, and she was not a being who frightened easily or reported things she wasn't certain of. When Vres filed a report, her superiors read it. She saw the human in the lower processing bay. near the secondary equipment lockers that the freight operation used for overflow storage. She saw him before he saw her, because she'd been standing in the shadow of a coolant manifold when he came through the bay's maintenance hatch. A hatch that should have been secured, that was secured, that she'd personally checked the lock on 3 days ago, and that he came through with no apparent difficulty, moving at a crouch, wearing a work suit that had been patched in at least 11 places she could count and carrying a satchel over one shoulder. She had her sidearm out before he'd taken 2 steps. He stopped, he looked at her. She said, in standard trade, "That equipment locker is property of the Teshari freight." He put his hand up. Not in surrender, she'd seen surrender, she knew what it looked like. It looked like the body trying to make itself smaller. This was something else. His hand came up and he held it still, palm out, and he looked at her with the kind of focus that made her feel like she was being read, processed, filed away. "I know," he said, "I'm not here for your locker." What she saw in those next few seconds would take her 2 hours to write up in a coherent report, because what she saw did not cohere. The man's work suit, she'd initially registered as patched and functional. When she looked more carefully, she realized that portions of it were not patched, they were augmented. There were components attached to the suit's frame that she recognized as Teshari microthruster units, the kind used for EVA correction. There was a bracer on his right forearm that she identified, after a long moment, as the sensor array from a Class III proximity mine, stripped out and remounted, integrated somehow into the suit's wiring. There were things she couldn't identify at all, things that might have been fabricated from salvage by someone with a background in engineering and a very specific problem to solve. He looked to Vress like a weapon that had built itself. She was a veteran, she was not frightened easily. She kept the sidearm level and said, "What are you here for?" He looked at the locker behind her, and then he looked at her and he said, "I need the thermal unit from your overflow stack. 3rd shelf, middle bay. I can see the corner of it from here. It's a Teshari standard MF7, and you've got 4 of them, and I need 1, and I'll pay you 60 credits for it when I have 60 credits, which I don't right now." She stared at him. He said, "I've got a woman in a life support capsule in the maintenance bay, 6 years in MFS. I need that thermal unit or she dies. I'd appreciate the loan." Vress later described the encounter, in her official report, as an engagement with a heavily augmented combatant of unknown affiliation, displaying biomechanical modifications consistent with military-grade enhancement technology, wielding jury-rigged Teshari equipment components in a configuration that suggested specialized combat or infiltration training. She noted that the individual had penetrated a secured facility without detectable forced entry, and had demonstrated tactical awareness and threat assessment capability exceeding typical civilian salvager parameters. She classified him as a Category 3 threat and recommended mandatory detention and biometric profiling. She'd given him the thermal unit. She hadn't been sure why later when she thought about it. She'd wanted to say it was because the sidearm had a malfunction, which wasn't true. She'd wanted to say he'd been faster than her, which also wasn't true. She'd had the drop on him completely. She'd given him the thermal unit because she'd looked at him, and she'd made a calculation, the kind of calculation that 6 campaigns teach you to make in the space between heartbeats. She'd looked at him and she'd thought, this one does not stop. What she'd seen was a man who hadn't slept properly in days, running on determination and machinery of his own improvised construction, with no credits and no leverage and no play to make except the truth. She'd given him the thermal unit. She'd reported him as a biomechanical combatant because she needed to explain to herself as much as anyone else why she hadn't stopped him. The station commander was a Teshari officer named Vale Chorus who'd been cycling through postings like Urine 9 for most of his career, not because he lacked competence, but because he lacked the political instincts that led to better assignments. He was methodical. He read everything. He'd read Drevashfor's report about the shadow in the maintenance corridors, and he'd read Vress's report about the augmented combatant in the processing bay. And he was now reading a third report that had come in from a customs inspector named Chev who worked the upper dock rings. Chev's report was brief. She described a human male, matching the same general description as the previous two reports, who had approached her customs station in the upper ring and presented a dock access request for Bay 14, which was a medical suite that had been decommissioned 6 months ago when the station's primary medic left. The human had asked to use the suite for a non-commercial medical procedure involving a rescued survivor. He had no credits to pay the access fee. He had instead presented Chev with a piece of salvage that he'd assessed at a value of approximately 40 credits, a sensor relay housing from an old survey-class vessel in functional condition. He'd placed it on her desk and looked at her and said, very simply, "Will this cover it?" Chev noted in her report that she was unable to verify the salvage value on the spot. She had allowed access to Bay 14 in exchange for the relay housing on a provisional basis, pending valuation. She noted that the individual had thanked her and proceeded to the decommissioned bay with a float dolly carrying a life support capsule and an assortment of equipment including one Teshari MF7 thermal regulation unit. She noted, almost as an afterthought, that the individual's left forearm had been wrapped in what appeared to be pressure bandage, and that there was fresh blood on the outside of the wrapping. Vale Chorus read all 3 reports. He read them twice. He spread them out on his command console and read them in sequence like a puzzle. A shadow in the maintenance corridors, an augmented combatant in the processing bay, a wounded salvager negotiating access to a medical suite. He sat back. He was a methodical being. He thought about the 3 accounts, and he thought about what they had in common, and he thought about what they described separately as 3 different encounters and what they described together as a pattern. 3 beings had encountered something, and each had described it differently. A creature of shadow, a weaponized machine, a desperate man. 3 interpretations, 3 threat assessments, 3 sets of recommended actions ranging from spiritual consultation to immediate detention to provisional clearance. He thought, what exactly does a being look like when 3 of my people look at it and see 3 completely different things? He thought they see what they're afraid of. He thought, so what is the real thing? Kale worked on the capsule for 11 hours. He'd gotten the thermal unit from Vress. He'd gotten the power cell from a parts dealer in the lower ring, a Varathi with 17 arms, and a reputation for exorbitant pricing. By trading the last piece of anything he owned that had resale value, an antique calibration tool from Earth that his grandmother had given him and that he'd been carrying for 12 years. He'd gotten the atmosphere scrubber by crawling through 200 meters of maintenance tunnels to reach a decommissioned section of the station where 3 scrubbers had been left behind when the equipment was moved, and where one of them, when he tested it, was still functional. He got the medical suite access by paying for it with salvage that he'd pulled from the dead pod itself, the pod's own navigation computer, which was non-functional but whose housing was intact and valuable. He was left with 11 credits and a thermal unit, a power cell, an atmosphere scrubber, and a decommissioned medical suite that was mostly functional if he didn't need the surgical suite or the diagnostic imaging or the pharmaceutical synthesizer or basically anything, except the life support bed and the environmental controls. He could work with that. He transferred Mara Coles from the life support capsule to the medical bed with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who understood that the margin between alive and not was currently very thin, and he was not going to be the thing that closed it. He got the thermal unit calibrated. He got the power cell integrated with the suite's secondary systems. He got the atmosphere scrubber running, which improved the air quality in the suite from recycled station air to something closer to what a human respiratory system expected. Then he sat beside the bed and watched the readouts and tapped his knuckle against the bed rail in a rhythm that wasn't quite random and wasn't quite music. And he waited. At the 4th hour, her core temperature began to come up. At the 7th hour, her heart rate stabilized. At the 9th hour, she made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was a sound that had aspirations toward being a word that had once been part of a word's vocabulary and might be again, given enough time. Cale leaned forward. He checked the readouts. He checked them again. He put his hand on the bed rail, carefully not touching her because the cellular recovery from MFS was still ongoing and contact was contraindicated, and he said very quietly, "You're on urine 9. You're in a medical suite. You've been in MFS. You're coming out of it." She made the sound again. "You don't need to answer," he said. "I'm just telling you, you've been out for about 6 years. Your ship is gone. I don't know what happened to your crew. I found your pod at salvage auction. I paid 1 credit for it because everyone else thought you were dead." He paused. "You weren't dead." A long silence. The thermal unit hummed. The atmosphere scrubber cycled. Outside, the station made the noises stations make, distant, structural, geological in their indifference. Then very softly, "I know." Vale Chorus came to the medical suite on the 11th hour. He came alone, which was either a statement of confidence or a mistake, and he hadn't yet decided which. He'd read the reports 3 times. He'd done something he almost never did, which was to ask around quietly, through the informal network of station workers and vendors who knew the lower ring the way Teshari soldiers didn't, the way you only knew a place if you'd been living in it hand-to-mouth for 8 months. He'd asked about the human who lived in the lower residential ring. He'd heard, good at fixing things, quiet, doesn't cause trouble. He'd heard, terrible at cards. He'd heard, spent 6 weeks drawing maps of the maintenance tunnels when he first arrived, which everyone had thought was strange, and then used those maps to fix a coolant leak in the ventilation system that had been slowly poisoning 3 corridors, which everyone had thought was less strange and more useful. He'd heard, he's been trying to get enough credits together to do something with a pod he bought. Nobody knows what, he won't say. Vale Chorus came to the medical suite. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the human, who was sitting beside a medical bed, in a work suit patched 11 or more times, with a pressure bandage on his left forearm that was crusted through. And he looked at the woman on the bed, who was awake in the technical sense of the word and breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone learning to breathe again, and he thought about his 3 reports. Cale looked up. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't move. He looked at Vale Chorus the way Vress had described, that reading, processing, filing away look, and then he said, "If you're here to run me in, give me 2 hours." "For what?" Vale Chorus said. "She needs 2 more hours before the thermal protocol is complete. After that she can be moved and I can be detained or whatever you need me to do." He looked back at the readouts. 2 hours. Vale Chorus stood in the doorway for a moment. He was methodical. He thought about the 3 reports. He thought about the being who had looked like a shadow and a war machine and a wounded man, all to different observers on the same day. "I had 3 separate accounts of you," he said, "filed this morning." "I heard," Cale said. "Station gossip travels fast." 3 soldiers. 3 different descriptions. One described you as a being that could pass through walls. Another described you as some kind of augmented military combatant. He paused. The third described you as a salvager trying to save someone's life with equipment he couldn't pay for. Cale glanced at him. "Which one did you believe?" Vale Chorus looked at the woman on the bed. He looked at the thermal unit that definitely belonged to a Teshari freight operation. He looked at the pressure bandage, and he thought about how a man got wounded in the maintenance tunnels and then kept going anyway. "The third one," he said. Cale looked back at the readouts. 2 hours, he said again. "I'll wait," Vale Chorus said, and he stepped inside and found a section of wall to lean against, and he waited. They talked in those 2 hours. Not about much. in the way that people who have been through something talk around the edges of it without going directly at it because the direct route is still too raw. Vale Chorus asked how the human had gotten into the secured processing bay, because Vress's report was technically a security breach, and he needed something to write down. Kale said he'd used the maintenance access hatch, which ran from tunnel J14 through the ventilation exchange, and that the hatch's internal lock had a manufacturing defect that allowed it to be tripped by applying lateral pressure to the lower left of the housing. He said he'd noticed it 3 months ago and had been meaning to report it, but hadn't gotten around to it. He offered to fix it if the station had the parts. Vale Chorus made a note about the hatch and did not write anything about the breach. Vale Chorus asked about the equipment on the work suit, the micro thrusters, the sensor array from the proximity mine, the other components that Vress had classified as military-grade augmentation technology. Kale looked down at his suit as if he'd half forgotten what was on it, the way you forget about tools when you've been using them long enough that they become extensions of your hands. He explained the micro thrusters. They were for EVA work, standard corrections. He'd salvaged them from a scrapped maintenance drone 3 months ago, and they'd been useful twice. He explained the sensor array. The proximity mine had been floating in a debris field near the station, non-functional, and he'd taken it apart because the sensor housing was valuable, and the array itself, it turned out, could be jury-rigged to detect pressure differentials in sealed environments, which was useful for identifying compromised seals in the maintenance tunnels before they became catastrophic failures. He'd found 4 compromised seals since he'd started using it. Vale Chorus made a note about the 4 compromised seals and marked them for maintenance follow-up. He asked eventually about the woman. He asked carefully, the way you ask about something that carries weight. Kale was quiet for a moment. He tapped his knuckle against the bed rail, the rhythm, the almost music. Survey Corps, he said, ISV Perseverance. She was mapping the OSC system when her ship went down. He paused. I knew her, trained at the same facility, different programs. We lost touch when she shipped out. Another pause. I heard the Perseverance was declared lost about a year after I came out here. I've been looking for the pod since. Vale Chorus was quiet, processing this. You came to Uran 9 looking for her pod, he said. Kale didn't answer, which was an answer. The salvage contract that went into receivership, Vale Chorus said, thinking aloud. You took it because it brought you to the OSC system. Kale glanced at him. There was something in the look, not quite a smile, not quite an acknowledgement. Just the look of a man who had been read correctly and had decided it was all right. She was out here, he said. Somebody had to be. On the bed, Mara Coles made a sound that might have been a word, and both of them turned to look at her. Her eyes were open now, not the empty open of MFS, but actual eyes with actual light in them, with the slow gathering quality of consciousness returning from a very long way away. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the station's structural architecture, then at the readouts on the thermal unit, then at Kale. She looked at him for a long time. You look terrible, she said. Her voice was 6 years unused and it showed, but it was a voice. Kale Morrow laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from a place that had been under pressure for a long time and had just found an outlet, the kind that sounded almost like something else before it settled into what it was. He put his hand on the bed rail and he said, You've been asleep for 6 years. You don't get to have opinions about how I look. She made a sound that was probably the beginning of an argument, which meant she was going to be fine. Vale Chorus stood in the doorway of the medical suite and watched the human sit beside the bed and talk to the woman, and he thought about his 3 reports. He'd spent 23 years in the Teshari military. He'd served in 6 sectors. He had read, in that time, hundreds of engagement reports, threat assessments, contact logs. He'd learned to read between the lines of them, to understand that what an observer described told you as much about the observer as about what was observed. Drevash 4, young and frightened and alone in a dark corridor, had seen a being of shadow, something that could only be understood as supernatural because the alternative, that a living creature had moved through that corridor without being caught, was more frightening than the supernatural explanation. Res, a combat veteran who had learned to categorize everything she encountered by threat level, had seen a military asset, something she could file and assess and respond to with protocol, because the alternative, that an ordinary person had built something extraordinary out of necessity and determination, didn't fit any category she had. Chev, the customs inspector, had seen a desperate man with a piece of salvage and a very direct request, and she'd made the simplest calculation of all. 3 accounts, 3 observers, 1 being. He thought about the human, the maintenance tunnel maps made in the first weeks of arrival, the compromised seals reported to nobody because nobody had asked, the antique tool traded for a power cell, the 6 months of watching the salvage auction listings for a dead pod from a ship declared lost years ago. He thought about the question he'd asked, and the answer that wasn't quite an answer. She was out here. Somebody had to be. He'd spent 23 years classifying things. He was good at it. He had a classification for almost everything he encountered: threat level, asset value, operational category, engagement protocol. He didn't have a classification for this. He stood in the doorway for another few minutes. The human was talking to the woman, something quiet he couldn't hear from the doorway. The woman was responding slowly, with the careful effort of someone rebuilding the connection between thought and language after a very long interruption. The thermal unit hummed. The atmosphere scrubber cycled. Vale Chorus thought, I had 3 reports and they described a ghost, a machine, and a man. The ghost and the machine were explanations. The man is the thing. He thought, the man mapped the tunnels so he could move through them without being seen. Not because he wanted to be invisible, because he needed to get somewhere and the normal routes cost money he didn't have. He thought, the man built a sensor array out of a disarmed mine because the sensor array was useful, and the mine was sitting in a debris field where nobody had collected it yet. Not because he was a soldier, because he was a salvager, and a salvager doesn't waste things that work. He thought, the man came to this station on a failing contract and stayed for 8 months because somewhere in the debris field around a dead planet there was a pod with a woman inside it who wasn't quite dead yet. He thought, 3 of my soldiers looked at this human and saw something alien, something beyond human parameters, something that could not be explained by the standard calculus of what humans were supposed to be capable of. He thought they were not entirely wrong, just wrong about the reason. He thought, the reason is not that this human is something other than human. The reason is that this human is entirely, completely, stubbornly, irrevocably human in a way that we have not learned to account for. He is not a ghost. He is not a machine. He maps tunnels in the dark and trades away things he loves for things that are needed. And he stays in a failing situation for 8 months, because leaving would mean accepting that someone he couldn't get to in time was lost. And he is constitutionally incapable of accepting that until the evidence is absolute and final, and even then he would probably argue with the evidence. He thought, I do not know what category to put that in. He stepped back from the doorway. He considered the 3 reports on his command console, the 3 different descriptions of the same human on the same day, and he thought about which of them he was going to write in his summary. He wrote, Human salvager, non-military, no affiliation, low threat assessment. Recommend station access clearance, provisional residency extension, maintenance contract evaluation. Note, has identified and can be contracted to address 4 compromised seals in ventilation tunnel J section, and knows the location of a manufacturing defect in processing bay maintenance hatch. Potential asset. He did not write, I think we have been miscounting them. I think we look at humans and we see what we expect, what we're afraid of, what our categories allow, and we do not look at what is actually there, which is something that I do not have a word for in my language and which may require a new word. I think we have been looking at humans the way my young conscript looked down a dark corridor and saw a ghost, and the ghost was a man who needed to cross the room. He didn't write it, but he thought it, standing in the corridor of a salvage station orbiting a dead world, listening to the faint sound of two humans talking to each other through the cracked-open door of a decommissioned medical suite. Mara Cole spent 4 days in the suite before she could stand without assistance. She spent another 3 before she could move through the station without leaning on something. Kale was there for most of it, not hovering, not anxious, just present in the way that stubborn people are present, the way that means I'm not going anywhere. She asked him about the contract, the salvage company that had gone into receivership. He told her about it in the same tone he used for everything factual, calm, specific, not dramatic. She asked how long he'd been looking for her pod. He said 8 months plus the transit time. She said that was a long time to spend looking for someone who might not be alive. He said he'd thought about that and decided to keep looking anyway. She asked, "What would you have done if I'd been dead?" He considered this with the seriousness she'd seen him apply to mechanical problems, the look that meant he was actually engaging with the question rather than offering a comfortable answer. "Paid 1 credit for the pod," he said finally, "and gone home." She looked at him. "That's it." "I'd have gone home with the information," he said, "that you were there, that the pod got there, that the MFS triggered and gave you the best shot it could, that it wasn't nothing." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside the porthole, the dead world of Osk turned very slowly, the cinder color of something exhausted. "It wasn't nothing," she said. "No," he said, "it wasn't." On the 5th day, she told him what had happened to the Perseverance. It took a long time to tell, and he listened to all of it, and when she was done they sat in the kind of silence that follows the weight of a thing finally put down after being carried for a long time. He tapped his knuckle against the bed rail, the rhythm that wasn't quite random. She recognized it. She'd heard it before, years ago, in a training facility cafeteria where a junior salvage technician used to sit and tap that rhythm on the table while he read the equipment manuals that everyone else used as coasters. She'd asked him once what the rhythm was. He'd said it was a song his mother used to hum. He didn't know what it was called. He just knew the rhythm. She asked him about it again here, in the decommissioned medical suite on a salvage station at the edge of nowhere. He thought about it. He said, "I don't remember the song, just that it goes like that." "You've been tapping it for as long as I've known you," she said. "I know," he said. "It's just what my hands do when I'm working through something." She watched him. The dead world turned outside the porthole. "Are you still working through something?" she asked. He looked at her, that reading, processing look, but different now, less armored, more direct. He said, "Yeah, but I think I'm getting somewhere." On the 7th day, Vale Chorus came to the suite again. He came with paperwork, a provisional residency extensions, a maintenance contract for the ventilation system, a work authorization that covered the station's lower ring. He came also with a question. He stood in the doorway and he looked at the two humans and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Kale nodded. "The 3 accounts I received," Vale Chorus said. "A shadow, a machine, a man. One of my soldiers was convinced you could pass through walls. Another was convinced you were a military augment. Did you know that's how they saw you?" Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't think about it. I was trying to get to Bay 14. I went through the routes that were available to me." He paused. "I didn't know I looked like anything to anybody. I was just trying to get where I was going." Vale Chorus was quiet. "The routes that were available to you," he said. "The maintenance tunnels, the processing bay hatch with the defective lock, the salvage trade for the access fee." "Yeah. You built a path out of what was there." Kale looked at him with a kind of patient attention. "That's what salvage is," he said. "You find what's there and you figure out what it can be used for. The tunnels were there. The lock defect was there. The salvage was there. He paused. She was there, I just had to get to her. Vale Chorus looked down at the paperwork in his hands. He thought about 23 years of service and 6 sectors and hundreds of reports and the categories he'd built, carefully, methodically, for everything he encountered. He thought about the 3 reports on his console and the 3 different descriptions of the same human. He thought, we have been looking at them wrong, all of us. For longer than this morning, longer than this station, longer than I've been stationed anywhere. We look at them and we see what they do, the things they build, the systems they hack, the routes they find through places they're not supposed to be able to reach, and we assign the wrong category. We call it supernatural or military or augmented. We call it something other than human, because if it's something other than human, then we have a protocol for it. And if it's human, then we have to ask why our protocols don't account for it. We look at the shadow in the corridor, and we don't ask how a man moved through the dark without being seen. We ask what kind of creature can do that. We look at the components on the work suit, and we don't ask why a man with no money and a specific problem built a sensor array out of a disarmed mine. We ask what kind of weapon he's carrying. We look at the credit trade at the customs desk, and we don't ask why a man who owned one valuable thing was willing to trade it for a chance. We note that he seemed desperate and move on. We don't ask the right question. The right question was, what is this being willing to do, and what for, and how far, and what does that tell us about what they are? He handed Cale the paperwork. The maintenance contract starts next week, he said. Standard rate, paid weekly. Cale took it. He looked at it, and then he looked at Vale Chorus, and Vale Chorus had the sense, again, persistent, the same sense he'd had standing in the doorway 2 hours into the 11-hour vigil, that he was being read, processed, filed somewhere in this human's internal accounting. Thank you, Cale said. It was a simple statement, 2 words. Vale Chorus had heard them 10,000 times in his career, in 20 languages, in contexts ranging from the trivial to the deeply consequential. He understood them to be, in most contexts, a social mechanism, a transaction of acknowledgement. The words didn't usually carry weight. They carried weight now. He could feel it. He said, I'll leave you to the recovery. The documentation is all there. He stepped back. Then he stopped, because there was one more question, the one that had been sitting at the edge of everything else since he'd first read the 3 reports. Your 3 accounts, he said. 3 beings who saw you and described 3 completely different things. If you'd had to choose one, shadow, machine, man, which would you say was closest? Cale Morrow looked at him. He looked at Mara on the bed. He looked at the maintenance contract in his hands and the dead world outside the porthole and the atmosphere scrubber that had been running for 7 days on a borrowed power cell. He looked at his work suit with its 11 patches and its salvaged thrusters and its repurposed sensor array. He looked at the pressure bandage on his arm, the wound he'd gotten sliding through a crawlway 3 days ago and hadn't slowed down for. He said, man. Just the one word, simple, direct, in the tone of someone stating a fact that they have no interest in arguing about because it is simply true and the truth requires no defense. Vale Chorus nodded slowly. He filed it. He thought he would be thinking about it for a long time. He left the 2 humans to their recovery and their reunion and their quiet, irreducible humanness, and he walked back through the corridors of the salvage station to his console and his 3 reports, and he sat down, and he began to write a 4th account. His own. It would take him a long time to get it right, not because he didn't know what he'd seen, but because he was trying to find the right category and he kept arriving at the same conclusion. There wasn't one, not in his language, not in his training, not in 23 years of careful, methodical service. There was only the thing itself, a man in a patched suit in the dark, moving towards something he was not willing to leave behind. He wrote that down. He looked at it for a long time. He thought, that's not a threat assessment. That's not a category, that's not a protocol. He thought, I don't know what it is. He thought, but I know what it isn't. It isn't what we've been calling it. It isn't the ghost in the corridor, or the weapon in the suit, or the desperate case at the customs desk. He looked at the dead world through his own porthole, the cinder planet stripped and abandoned, orbiting its dim star in permanent exhaustion. He thought, they don't stop. He thought, we keep looking for the thing that makes them dangerous, the augmentation, the technology, the tactical advantage, and we keep missing what it actually is. It's the rhythm they tap on the bed rail. It's the maps they draw in their first month in an unfamiliar place, in case they need to move through it in the dark. It's the song they can't remember the name of because their mother used to hum it and their mother is somewhere very far away. It's the 1 credit they pay for a dead pod, because they're not ready yet to agree that dead means gone. He stared at his screen. He thought, we don't have a category for that. We should build one. He saved the report. He opened a new document, a personal document that would go nowhere, be filed nowhere, would simply be a thought he'd had on a morning on a salvage station at the edge of an exhausted system. He wrote in Teshari at the top of the empty page, things I got wrong. He started at the beginning. It took him a long time.